One important aspect about SQL query writing, and something that is important to effectively write SQL queries, is to understand the elements of a database, that is, the tables of a database, and subsequently the structure of those tables. Fortunately, MySQL Workbench makes it easy to look at the composition of a database and the subsequent composition of the tables within the database. It does this through the use of the Schemas tab. The Schemas tab is right next to the Administration tab. The Administration tab to a user of the database is not very useful. The Schemas tab, on the other hand, allows us to look at the databases that we have access to on the database server. Now, one of the important things to also note is that under the Schemas tab, under the Schema and the Administration pane, we have Object Info. This object information is going to display information about specific elements of the database and elements of the table. So let's go ahead and let's click on Classic Models. Take a look. When I click on Classic Models, we see that the schema under Object Info is changed to Classic Models. Note that there are these arrows right next to the left of the name of the database. Clicking on the arrow to the left of the database Classic Models brings us a drop-down. The drop-down has 4 options available: tables, views, stored procedures, and functions. These are different features that are part of this database. As we can see, there are no arrows next to views, stored procedures, and functions in the current iteration of this database. In an iteration that you might use, you might actually find arrows next to these elements, indicating that these can be further expanded. There is, however, one arrow next to the table element of the Classic Models database, and so let's go ahead and click that. And so on clicking of the arrow right next to tables, we see that we can now view all of the different tables that are present under this Classic Models database. Clicking on any specific table provides information about that table under Object Information. We see that the table name is Customers, and it has several columns: customer number, name, last name, first name, phone, so on and so forth. Right next to the names of these columns, we also have information about the data types associated with these columns. Now, what use is this information? This is useful information if we want to write SQL queries based on specific columns to know what kind of data might be present in these columns. That is going to help us determine the kinds of operations we can perform on these columns. This object information shows up for every table. So subsequently, if I click on the employees table, I get information about the columns and the data types of those columns. For the employee table, for the products table, for the orders table, and so on and so forth. Notice that these tables also have an arrow right next to them, and so we can go ahead and click, for instance, the arrow right next to the left of customers. And we see that the customers table has columns, indexes, foreign keys, and triggers. Again, these are characteristics of tables that we are seeing over here. And specifically, if you click on the arrow next to columns, we see specific columns that are present within this table, and specifically how we need to use these column names in a query. Notice under object information, we see the data type and the correct spelling of the name of the column. Again, this is really useful for us when we want to refer to certain columns in a query. We want to know what the names of the columns are, and how to use specific casing associated with these columns. And so the schemas pane that we see provides a lot of information about a database and tables that help us correctly formulate queries on a database or tables. Now, one thing that might occur when you are working in MySQL Workbench is that your interface on the left might change. And how might it change? Instead of object information, you might see something that looks like this. You are clicking on tables, you're clicking on customers tables, and you are not seeing any information down here. The object information pane has disappeared. This frequently happens when, I mean, for instance, your mouse may have just inadvertently pulled down the pane. And so try to find the dot. Over here, the dot is right here where my cursor is right now, and try to pull the pane up. This can happen in both directions. This pane can go up all the way and we lose the schemas pane, or we can lose the object info pane and only have access to the schemas pane. So please pay attention to this dot and make sure that it is somewhere centered so that you can see both the schemas pane and the object information pane. This concludes this video on explaining certain elements of the MySQL Workbench interface. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much. In this video, I will be explaining how to run the SQL queries on the SQL server through MySQL Workbench. Currently, the active database is the classic models database, and we have a blank query window. Consider the following query. As you can see, we have this query that retrieves the name of the customer and the country the customer is from the customers table, where the country is Italy, the country of the customer is Italy specifically, and the credit limit of the customer is greater than $25,000. To execute the query, we have two options. The first option is leave your cursor on the query. What this means is that take your mouse pointer and click on some element of this query. Anywhere on it is going to be just fine. Subsequently, click on this button right here. It looks like a lightning bolt and has a cursor through it. If you click on the lightning bolt with the cursor, we see that the query is executed. It's executed successfully with a check mark at the bottom left-hand side under Action Output. There is another way to execute the query. So let's take a second query. In this second query, I am listing out the customer name and country from the customers table where the country is Japan. If you prefer to use keyboard shortcuts instead of mouse, you can hit Control Enter on a Windows machine when your cursor is on the query, or Command Enter on a Macintosh when your cursor is on the query. So I've left my cursor, the active cursor is on the query, and I'm going to hit on my Macintosh Command Enter or Command Return, and we see that the query is successfully executed. This is how one goes about executing queries on a database server in MySQL Workbench. In this video, I'll be explaining how to save queries that are written in the MySQL Workbench environment under the Queries tab. Consider the following interface where you have a blank query window and you are proceeding to write queries. Currently, the active database is the classic models database as it is highlighted and bolded. And under this database, we have several tables and we shall be writing a query on one of these tables. For instance, the query is comes to the following query, and we now wish to save this query on our computer. To save a query in MySQL Workbench, we have two options. The first option, if you prefer to use your keyboard directly instead of your mouse to hit save, is on a Windows machine to hit Control S and on a Macintosh to hit Command S. That pulls up a window allowing us to save the SQL script. Notice the extension of the SQL script is .sql, and we can change and give it any name we want, allowing us to save it in any folder that we want. This would save the query on your computer, and you would subsequently be able to find that query or set of queries on your computer and open it. Another way to save, if you don't prefer to use keyboard shortcuts, is to click on File, Save Script. This is going to pull up the same window, and we can save our SQL code and the SQL queries that we have written. This is how one goes about saving SQL queries in MySQL Workbench. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.